Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. And today, I'm going to interview Robert. Okay, and he's going to tell us some fantastic ghost stories, because these are the type that I like. The real ones. Okay, here we go. Give me that. Here we go. I got you, Robert.
Okay.
Go ahead. So tell us that story.
Let me tell you. Let me give you a little history first.
Go ahead.
We came from a house in Queens, right? That was built like mid-20s, I think it was at the time. It was only like a few houses on that street.
Okay.
It was basically a bungalow house at the time, so it wasn't really meant for year-round, but it was converted into a regular house eventually, right? My grandfather bought the house, right? And then he bought the house next to it, so we had two houses on one property. When my parents got married, they moved into this house, and we were raised there as kids, right? This is going back from the 40s and the 50s, right? And we eventually, as we got older, we built a little basement part. It was a basement.
Okay.
It's one of those half basements that goes down, has windows all around, you know, that kind of thing.
Right.
We kind of fixed up the basement and made it a hangout, right?
Okay.
It was like 18 to 20 years old. We were hanging out, and a bunch of guys, whatever, would come in. The party room. You know
Yeah,
I mean?
of course.
The cave, we used to call it, right? So we had windows on the side, big windows that went this way. That was on one side of the house. There was a gas station across the street that was always lit up, right?
Okay.
And they used to light up the house. Then we had windows in the back. And there was a door, and then you open the door and you come down the steps, right?
Okay.
And you're into the area where we're sitting and stuff. So we used to hang out, watch TV, music, whatever, right? And I've noticed, not only me, but everyone else used to come down. We used to see shadows walking by on the side of the house.
Okay.
Right? And I'm like, oh, that's weird. It looks like somebody's walking by on the outside. And it's like, well, it's the gas station that has these lights on. You know how bright lights are on gas stations. So I think it must be people walking down the sidewalk in front of the house.
Okay.
And we're seeing the shadow going that way. And go, yeah, so it must be, right? That was going on for like months, right? And then all of a sudden in the back of the house, right, where it's dark and there's no lights, we started seeing a shadow going across the window.
Okay.
And I'm like, that's weird. It looks like somebody's walking this way and then walking back that way, right?
Right. Doesn't make
So
sense.
we were like, it must be an optical illusion, whatever. Never thought twice about it, right? So one night, me and Carl, right, hanging out, we're watching television. I think we were watching some old Abbott and Costello movies or something like that. I'm looking at the shadow going back. I say, there goes that shadow again. Isn't that weird? And we look at it. I go, yeah, it's the shadow, right? About 10 seconds later, right, there's a little doorway that you can see out.
Right.
I jump up, and I go, who's that? Right? We jump up, and Carl jumps up, and he goes, who the hell is that guy, right? A guy walks by, right?
Okay.
Past the doorway, right? He was wearing like an old suit, a really old suit. Wasn't with the times. I was like, that's weird. Who the hell is this guy? We jumped up, right? Figured, what the hell? Let's go knock the hell out of this guy.
Okay.
I had no idea who he was, right?
Right.
We run in the back. We go back. There's nothing back there. There's no way out.
And he was solid looking.
There's a cement wall, right?
Okay.
So you can't go anywhere past that.
Right.
And there was nobody there at that point, right? And we looked at each other. I go, did you see that? He goes, I saw that, right?
Yeah.
We described him, what he was, the guy in this suit. So we were like, goosebumps. We said, let's get the hell out of here, right? We left, right? Took off. Creeped us out completely, right? And eventually we went back into the basement, right? So the next day I told my mom, because she lived upstairs, right?
Right.
I said, you know, this weird thing happened to us last night. We were in the basement sitting there. We saw this guy walk by. He goes, he was in a suit. Because that wasn't just me, so Carl saw it also. It was both of us. Freaked us out, right? And she's going, what did he look like? I said, he looked like a guy who was maybe like 50 years old or whatever. He had this suit on, looked like he came from the 30s or the 40s, right? And she goes, where did you see him? And I showed her. He goes, right here in the spot, like where you're standing. And she goes, well, you want to hear a really weird story about this place? I go, what? Because right where he was standing, there's a trapdoor on the top floor of the house. And the guy who used to own this house before lived by himself there. And right around, he was about 50 years old.
Right.
One night he came in the house and the trapdoor was open. He fell right through the trapdoor and died right on that spot.
Oh my God.
Right? That freaked us out completely.
Can
but
you
after
imagine?
we saw him, we never saw the shadows again on the windows.
Isn't that incredible?
So that was weird.
And
that
then it makes you even think, well,
weird
what did he have a
story.
trap door for? Like, that's also weird.
Well, you know what it is? We had a coal burner in the basement.
Oh, okay.
It was
Okay,
one
I
of those
get it.
old houses.
Okay, now I understand. Okay.
And they used to put, I guess the coal used to go down.
Right, to go
there was
down
a
there.
trap door or whatever, and that was the access to it. So he, eventually, I guess he fell through that
Oh my God.
in the
whatever.
dark, walking in the
He
kitchen.
must have. Yeah, he just he ate it. He
That was freaky. Yeah, that was that was a sighting that we had seen. Right?
That is such a
And
fantastic
both of us
story.
never believed in ghosts or anything like that. I'm just like, and we weren't
no.
drunk.
You know,
we weren't
that's-
drinking. We weren't on drugs. I mean, we were watching television.
That's because that's what I call the real. You're not looking for it. You're
Yeah.
just doing your thing. All this time you're seeing shadows, but of course because of your age, you're like blowing it off, thinking, nah.
Right.
And then when you see it, it's not you're looking at it. And even then, it sounds like he was pretty solid looking that you followed it
Yeah.
or him to see who the hell is that guy.
Yeah, I mean, he walked by us. We jumped up, ran back there, and there's literally a cement wall. There's no way out. Nothing there.
And then your mom tells you that story.
Right.
Had your mom ever seen him?
No.
You guys were the only ones. Do you think because you guys were the ones always downstairs in the basement?
Probably, you know. I don't know. Who knows, you know.
And the reason why I say this
story.
is that I've run across people like that'll have experiences like that, like the kids or one of the kids or nobody believes them or your imagination. And then they say, well, 20 years later, they've either moved out or something and all the kids are growing up and then they start talking.
Mm-hmm.
Or the parents will fess up, yeah, I saw that, but I didn't want to tell you kids because I didn't want to scare you.
Well, she didn't want to tell us anything, right?
You know.
But she had stories too, my mom. So she believed me when I told her
I'm
that.
sure. But see, that's good because I've had others that their parents have kind of like shut them down because and I tell them, I think that sometimes the parents are scared because it's like your kid's not going to come and lie to you about something like that because...
Well, my mom, when she was young, she worked for the Army, I think it was, the map department during World War II.
Right.
Matter of fact, she's one of the people who had actually made the map for Hiroshima.
Wow.
Nagasaki. Right?
Okay.
And she had a story when she was living down in Washington.
Okay.
Right, you know where the lawns are. I forget what you call that area, like the reflecting pool is. And
Right.
Stuff like that.
Yes.
During World War II, they had that place set up with Quonset huts and tents, and people would work in there and do maps or whatever, and work for the Army Department or whatever, right? The Navy Department. And she used to play piano and stuff on the radio and stuff like that, right? And she had a bunch of friends that she lived with, and they had an apartment that was not far from there in D.C. And it was one of those old apartments that has, those doors that go up with the glass tops that open like vent
right
doors.
At the top, yes.
Right, so it was in one of those places. And one night she's awoken about 2:30 in the morning, she says, right? She looked at the clock. She heard someone calling her name, right? She said, Molly, that was her name. She says, Molly, Molly. She kept hearing it. And she heard like some rumbling out the door outside, and she was freaking out. Goes, somebody's out the door, right? So she was waking up her friends. Goes, do you hear it? And she's going, no, I don't hear anything, right? She says, go back to sleep. You're just having a dream. That's what she figured it was, right?
It's calling my name.
So she went back to sleep, and she heard it again, right? Her name was being called, right? And she knew somebody was at that door, right? So what she did is she took a little box, and she got one up to the door, and looked and peeked over through that little vent, and she saw this black figure there, like a shadow.
Oh my God.
And it freaked her out, right? And she had this feeling in her heart that if she opened that door, something really bad was going to happen, right?
Right.
And she looked at the clock at the time. I think it was like 4:37 in the morning, right?
Right. Yeah. Like.
And she just yelled at the door, "Go away! Leave us alone! Get out of here!" Right? And it stopped, right?
Wow.
She found out the next morning, right? Her aunt, right? My grandma's sister was giving birth to Helen at the time, right?
Okay.
And they were really close. My mom and them, they were like this, right? And while she was giving birth, she almost died on the table, right?
Wow.
And they said she was calling her name, Molly, Molly, Molly. And
wow,
she looked at the clock. It was at the exact time that she gave birth.
You know what?
She said she felt like if she had opened that door, she probably would have died, because my aunt almost died at the time. But she survived. She survived. Yeah.
But you know what? I've heard of stuff like that also, what they call those crisis apparitions, which is where people see after somebody just died, like before anybody really knows that the person died, that all of a sudden they'll see this person, like they think, how can I be seeing you? Right. And then they'll find out either the same day or the next day, oh yeah, that person passed away sometimes.
Right. So
that crisis apparition. I bet.
Creeped us out.
I don't blame her. I wouldn't have
we
opened
heard
the
that
door.
when we were kids, and she told us that story more than once. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
because
that was kind of
think
strange.
about it, stuff like that gets like I think imprinted in your brain. Like you said, she even knew precisely at what time this thing
Yeah.
is knocking on the door.
I mean, the coincidence is just too much. You know what I mean?
And then you
how can
ask
that
yourself,
be, you know?
and part of it I think is like she said, it was knocking at the door. In other words, it had to gain entry.
And she saw something, right? She
Right.
felt like if she opened the door, it would have been
Right.
really bad. So she had that feeling.
Right. And one time I interviewed this guy who he wrote a book, and he was a border patrol agent, and he said that after he had come out of training camp, like right after, one day he calls in sick, and one of the guys that was just like him had been out. He says that he's at home sick in bed, and he says that usually he would leave his radio and his uniform and stuff in the closet, and he says all of a sudden he hears it like crackling, like when somebody's trying to call you on it. And he was like, wow, this is really weird. And he says like he would like really weirded him out, because he says usually he would just turn his radio off, plus he wasn't working, he was at home sick. Turns out that he was like, he felt like, I'm not going to answer it, that's really weird. Comes in the next day, finds out that around midnight, this guy had gotten killed when they were patrolling down in Southern California, and they think that he had gotten pushed off the side of a mountain. They would patrol up there.
Wow.
So, you know how the new guys that get the bad schedules, they were going out there at night. So he didn't know about it, and he realized that around the time when he hears the story the next day, this is around the time that the radio starts to crackle like somebody's calling him. So he was like, oh, okay. But he says like a few days later, a week, something, the guy's getting buried. And that same night, same thing happens. He says I would always leave my uniform, my radio turned off, all that stuff in the closet. And he says he hears the radio crackling again on that same day that guy was buried. And he says there was a part of me that knew that like if I answered that communication, like I was going to open the door for something to come through that I didn't want.
My mom, yeah.
Which is like, even though it was a friend of his, somebody that he knew, it was like he says that he even took like the battery out of it, like he did not want to because it scared him so badly. And and then he had a lot of other stories where the guy later on was seen by different people out there. As a matter of fact, they even had some times because they had these groups of immigrants like crossing through, or there's kind of like you're crossing no man's land. There's that sometimes they would have groups of them turn themselves in because they had seen this guy that they knew was dead, or they would talk about. Eventually, something happened. He wrote a book about it, which was really interesting, that he wasn't seen anymore. And some of the things that people see, and it's not because they want to see it. In other words, they're just doing their job.
Right.
And it happens. And it's like, well, what are you going to do about it?
I got another story.
Yeah, I know you have another story. Go ahead.
This is a friend of ours that lives Long Island.
Prattville.
No, Kenny.
Oh,
Remember that one? Oh, Prattville, that's another one. Forgot about
that was
one.
something.
Let me tell you, Kenny, right? Young kid. He's
Now,
about
not 37, 40.
really severe asthma. I mean,
Yeah.
a few times they didn't think he
They
was
looked
going
left, right, three
they didn't think he
times.
was going to
Wow.
survive. He was
Okay.
really bad.
Yeah, very bad.
And one day the mom told us the story. Kenny never said anything about it. The grandfather had passed away. He was
Kathy's
really
father.
close to Kenny.
Because he's
right?
always worried about Kenny.
Yeah, he was always worried about Kenny with the asthma. And he
Right.
just, kept really close with him. Kenny would, after he passed away, he'd get up in the middle of the night and go to his mom. Goes, guess why Grandpa was here last night? He goes, where? Oh, he was sitting at the edge of the bed talking to me. He says he came from the garden to visit me, right? And we're taking conversations with him. And this happened like a few times,
Right.
right? And Kathy, the mom, was saying like, he's just
Right.
making up things. He's talking. It's understandable because he passed away. He's a young kid. He didn't understand what was going on, right? So it happened a few times, right? He kept saying the story. And then he tells, he goes, you know what, Mom? He goes, it was really weird. She goes, why? What's the matter? He goes, Grandpa was sitting on this edge of the bed talking, but he has no eyes, right?
Holy crap.
And so she's like, that's weird, So nothing came up, right? Just let it go, right? A few days later, the mom was talking to
Kathy was talking to the mom.
Kathy's
Her mom.
her mom, right? Kenny's grandma,
Right.
and told the story about Kenny and Grandpa's coming from the garden to visit, and he's talking, but he has no eyes, right? The grandma just dead silent.
Freaked out.
She goes, I didn't want to tell anybody this, but your grandfather, when he died, donated his eyes.
Oh my God.
No one knew it. No one knew this in the family.
Right, like exactly.
Except
How
for her,
is
she
this
never
kid?
said anything.
Yeah.
Oh
And
God.
Kathy is just a straight
That was
arrow.
freaky,
I
you
mean,
know?
she's like one of these very.
And she must have been
down-to-earth
like,
people.
can you imagine? And you know how they say in the movie, nobody believes the kid?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Everybody believed Kenny.
But the kid
Everybody
was like
believed Kenny
so
at that
happy
point.
that he was talking
Right,
to his
because
grandma.
when she's- Right, because when you're a kid, that's another thing that where they say that kids see more often because they don't try to filter it out or they don't try to analyze it or explain it or how can I see you if you're dead? None of that. They kind of they go with the flow.
So that was a freaky story. Another one.
Go ahead.
Friend of mine lived up in Queens, way out by St.
Incredible.
Albans, I think it was,
Yeah.
all the way on the edge, almost by Long Island, right? Bought a house, got married, right? Nice guy, used to work on cars a lot. His wife used to raise Dobermans, right? In the
Okay.
basement. They loved Dobermans. Had a bunch of them. They're really nice ones too, right? So one day I went over to the house to visit them, right? And the house was kind of dark and creepy. It was on a half acre of land. There was nobody around, right? It always seemed dark in the house. And I don't know why. So we're sitting around watching television, right? Drag racing was on or something on Saturday afternoon. We were watching that, right? And we kept hearing these noises on the wall. I said, it sounds like somebody's knocking. And the guy, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Forget about it, right? I'm like, that sounds weird. Where's it coming from? It sounds like the kitchen. This looks like the kitchen's right next door. He goes, don't worry about it. Don't even pay attention to it, right? So all of a sudden, you get the two Dobermans in the house, right? They start barking like crazy. They run through the kitchen. They have one of those flapping doors. Right? And we go running, and he goes, what the hell are you after? Right? And they're in the corner barking at nothing in the corner. Two Dobermans. Right?
Wow.
I'm like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah, right. Like, okay, enough with
It's
it's
we don't
nothing.
want to tell you, but this house is haunted.
It's like,
I'm
gee,
are you serious? I go, it is. It's haunted. I hear noises there all the time. The dogs bark at the walls, right?
Right, yeah, exactly.
This is freaky, yeah. So we're going out, right? And I'm looking down. These little another one of the houses with the half basement with these steps with a storm door that opens up like that, right? And all the dogs are in the cages down there, right? That's where they kept them at night and stuff. So they go, you want to go down and look at the dogs and stuff? So I'm going, I'll take a look. I'm like getting ready to walk down the steps. So, you know what? I don't want to go down there. I'm getting freaked out. I'm getting these chills. I swear, I was getting chills.
I don't know what it is about basements and cellars, man.
So I said, what the hell's with your house, man? He goes, why do you think it's haunted? Because that place is creeping me out. He goes, well, the owner who owned it hung himself in that basement.
Okay.
I'm like,
Holy
there you
crap,
go.
thank
I said,
you,
there's
thank
your haunting
you.
right there. Yeah.
It's like, forget
Freaked
it.
me. That one freaked me out. There was another one.
No, his was
And if they told me the story, I would have said, okay, it sounds cool and everything. But I was in the house.
So
I actually heard the noises, and when I saw the
And
dogs
that's the thing. He's trying
do
to.
that. That was like there's something else here.
And he's there, like trying to, like, nah, it's nothing.
Yeah,
it's nothing.
they're all like trying to hey, it's haunted. Don't worry about it. Just noises, noises. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, like, don't tell me that you're just knocking on the wall.
And they lived there for I don't know, 3 years in that house. They
Has
ended
it been
up
a long
getting
3
divorced
years?
for some strange reason and split up and they
That's
got rid of the house.
it's-
Yeah,
3 years is a long time for when you're in a place like that.
right. So that was kind of weird. Yeah.
That kind of. How about you? You told me you worked one time in an emergency room.
Because I wanted to speak to
Yeah,
them
I did.
about
I
my
worked.
father.
I worked
And
in
I
the
went there,
emergency room for a
and I
while.
couldn't do it.
I worked.
couldn't
I
do
worked
it.
throughout the hospital. I was there
So
for
I
almost
left.
20 years. As a nurse.
Because sometimes you get a lot of weird stuff that happens at hospitals.
I
and
used to work
emergency
night
rooms.
shift, and the weirdest thing, the only thing I ever saw that night or heard actually was working the burn unit at
Okay.
night, right? And burn units are nasty. I mean, it's horrible, right? So I'm sitting there one night. It's just me and this other nurse. It was only I think we had 3 patients. That was it, right? So I'm sitting there. I'm like listening to this howling sound coming down the hall. I said, "Who's screaming in pain?" Right?
Right.
He goes, "Did you hear that?" She goes, "I didn't hear anything, right?"
And you're like, what?
I keep hearing howling sounds coming out of this corner down the hall, right? And there's no patients in the rooms down there, right? So I'm going, this is weird, So I'm going to the doors, opening each door, looking inside, and I don't see anything, right?
Right.
So I got back and I'm sitting down doing my paperwork, right, writing my assignment. I hear this howling sound coming out. I said, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
There's somebody screaming in pain. And I don't know where it's coming from, right?
Right.
Went and checked all the rooms, right? And the 3 patients there, they were all out. Nothing, right? It went on for like a half hour and stopped, right? On and off, on and off, on and off. And I was the only one who heard it.
Isn't that
and she didn't hear it. And I was like, what the hell?
Well, you know what? Not too long ago,
Weird.
I did a tour, and later on we were interviewing people. I had this one guy. He works in a hospital now, and he worked like what you're talking about, like the overnight shift. And he's telling me how he heard like one time. He says, at that time you kind of know who you're taking care of, who's there, who's not.
Right.
He says, one time he hears a woman scream like in pain, like he says, man, this is not like a scream. This is like a scream. He goes, nothing. There was nobody. He could never account for it. He says it was almost like a scream, like they were killing her. Okay? And I think one other person heard it. But he says, at nighttime, there's not really that many people anyway there. But he was like, and he couldn't find any source for it. And he says, like, a lot of times, you'll see dark shadows and stuff like that. And after a while, you're like, okay, I'm not going to find out. I don't want to find out what that is.
Well, I've got the whole array. I've seen the shadows.
Okay.
I've seen the ghost.
Yeah.
The person. Literally saw the person. That heard the sounds.
Yeah. But you get a lot of stuff from places like that, especially when people pass away. You know what I'm saying? You get a lot of people that'll say, either because the people are in agony or because they're really seriously injured.
Yeah.
They're going to pass away, and you hear, a lot of unusual things because there's just something that swirls around that whole thing. And, they've got that angel of death theory where they say that in a lot of these places, or even nursing homes, you'll see, like, the dark shadow and things like that.
Sometimes you'll just feel it, too. You get freaked out, or you get the chills.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
What the hell is that island? Welfare Island in New York. Remember Welfare Island?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It used to be, now it's called the Roosevelt Island.
Yes,
because
I've heard of
Welfare
that.
Island is a bad name connotation to it. Nobody New York
Right.
has a bad reputation for that.
Crazy kid.
So they changed it to Roosevelt Island. I don't know if it's there anymore. I think they knocked it down, but all the way at the southern tip of the island, it's like right underneath the 59th Street Bridge.
Right.
There was an old hospital there. It was a huge hospital, and it was abandoned for years.
Right.
Right. I mean, the roofs were falling in on one part.
Right.
They had a morgue area that was disgusting. Had jars that were left there.
Yeah, because that's one of these things. When they leave, they just leave everything there.
So we used to go there like 18 years old, right? Like a bunch of guys, right?
Right.
Just to go there for kicks, scare the hell out of ourselves, right? And we got into this back door, right? And the place was like, what was that movie, The Shining? Remember that one with the, it kind of reminded me of that. This huge building with this large hallway and had a stairway on each end that went up. And all you saw was old metal hospital beds, like from the 20s and
right.
crap.
Because, I know what
the
you're
thing was just abandoned forever. It had a big fence around it, but the fence was,
right.
knocked down so you can walk right in. There's nobody there. It was pitch black. You had to go in with a flashlight to look around, right? So we used to go in there and walk around with this thing, right? Scared the living hell out of us. It was really freaky, right? The one guy that was with us was a cop, right?
It's like, right? They're the first ones that, like...
We took him there, right?
Danny?
Huh?
Was it Danny?
Danny, right?
Danny.
You know what? A lot of them, when it's flesh and blood, they don't have a problem. But when it's stuff like that, they're like,
A wheelchair, empty wheelchair, came flying and went across in front of him.
Oh my God!
Freaked him out, right? He ran like hell. Right?
I bet.
He just took off. We were like,
and it was like
that place. I mean, I didn't see anything except for that, right?
But that was enough.
But just walking in there, I mean, if you were going to look for spirits and anything, that was chock full of it. Yeah, it became a mental institution.
Hi, everybody. This is Marlene. You just saw me do that fantastic interview with Rob, who was great. His stories were. I could have sat there for hours and hours just listening to his stories. And one of the stories that he talked about was an experience that he had when he was a teenager going to this hospital on this island that sits right off New York on the river. And it just so happens that I've been working on a story precisely about that island and that hospital. And of course it's haunted because not only was it a hospital, it was what they called a pestilence hospital. Or quarantine hospital. This was where back then, because a lot of these diseases were deadly, at that time, the best thing that they could think of was to move people out of the general population and basically put them on this island. And it's inevitable that some of these, besides the fact that these diseases were deadly, we didn't have the medicines that we have now. It's just that apparently the staff was overwhelmed, so of course you're going to have hauntings. But the history on this place is super interesting, and you're going to see what I mean, that there is no doubt whatsoever that this place is haunted, and no wonder that he had the experiences that he did have. Now, the name of that hospital is called, well, let's get, why don't we call it, it's the island that it sits on. It's called North Brother Island or Welfare Island. There's various names for it, and it's located between the Bronx and Rikers Island. It's situated right in the middle of New York City's East River on an area known as Hell's Gate, and it's known as, the official name is North Brother Island. And in 1885, if you were sick and contagious, you would be brought to this 20-acre island along with other patients from the 5 boroughs. Now, in most cases, the patients did not come here voluntarily, but were forced to do so. It was far enough to stop disease from spreading, leaving those living and dying there feeling isolated. But in a city that was already overcrowded and pestilence-stricken, it was the best option to keep the populace safe and healthy. Now, the hospital that's on North Brother Island is called Riverside, and it was built on the north end of the island, and it was initially used for those stricken with smallpox. Now, over the decades, it was used to quarantine just about anybody that was infected with typhus, scarlet fever, yellow fever, any type of disease that could spread very easily, very quickly, and that they really did not have any antidotes for. Once on the island, there was food shortages and no heating during the cold winter months. So as a result of all of this, the mortality rate for those who were banished here was very high, to the point that being sent to North Brother Island was seen as practically synonymous with the death sentence. The bedraggled patients were not allowed to leave until they recovered, and these were the days before telephone, so many of the people who left for North Brother Island were never to return. And, of course, their friends and families never heard from them again or knew what became of them. This is why in some cases being sent there was equivalent to a death sentence. It was greatly feared. The island, it was greatly feared by the general populace, who refused to go anywhere near it. Even the ferries that would go up and down the river would give it a wide berth. That was the fear that they had of contagion. And they would have a steamer that belonged to the health department called the Franklin Edison, and it would deliver those that had been quarantined to North Brother Island, and it would alert with blasts what type of disease the patients had been infected with that they had on board. For example, 3 blasts were sounded to tell, in other words, this was the official language. For example, 2 long blasts spelled scarlet fever, 4 meant measles. The most dreaded, which was a long and a short blast, stood for typhoid fever. And smallpox, of course, were sent over there, which was the 3 blasts. Now, for example, the reputation of going to this island was so bad that one winter, there was an Italian mother who led police on a 3-week chase through the tenements with her sick baby, scattering smallpox contagion right and left. And she finally turns up unexpectedly in the offices with the baby of a Dr. Edison, who was on Mulberry Street. Now, the health department kind of knew where she was going through because of all the people that she got sick along the way that themselves ended up going to Riverside Hospital. There was another time that they found the health department found about 57 Russian exiles that were living in about half a dozen lodging houses. They're all cramped in there, and they're all suffering from typhus fever. They were all taken to Riverside Hospital, and then about another 100 went to join them before a week had passed, and that gives you an idea about people were really scared of going to Riverside to North Brother Hospital, but at the same time they kind of would pack themselves into these very cramped quarters. Remember, this is a time that immigrants were flooding in from all over the place. The tenements where people lived, and because of the poverty, they would all be cramped in together, which of course was deadly as far as spreading the disease. So it was sometimes whether you wanted to die on the tenement or die on the island. But in truth, though, they did try to take care of the people in the hospital there. It's just that they were very short-staffed. Now, like I said, even the ships going up the East River would just not even get close to this island. Also, they even had lepers who were brought to the island, and they confined them to wooden huts within the boundaries of the hospital. And this was New York City's only official leper colony. In other words, the lepers were quarantined even from the regular patients that were quarantined themselves on the island. So it was a quarantine within a quarantine island. But it wasn't just the leper colony for which North Brother Island became most notorious. This was also once home to Mary Mallon, an Irish immigrant known to history as Typhoid Mary. Mallon was thought to be responsible for spreading the deadly disease through a number of families, and with a fatality rate as high as 3 in 10, typhoid was particularly nasty way to go. First, she was brought to North Brother Island in 1907. And just to give you an idea, when you contracted typhoid, you start out with a low-grade fever, and then you get cramping, which is quickly leads to delirium as blood begins to clot beneath the skin. This is followed by inflammation of the brain and intestinal hemorrhaging. And the thing about Typhoid Mary, or Mary Mallon, however you want to call her, she was asymptomatic. In other words, she got everybody sick, but she didn't get sick. However, they did have enough science to trace who was causing the outbreak. So every job where she had been working at in New York, which was with food, people had started to become sick with typhoid, and some of them died. Now, she was incarcerated for 3 years at Riverside Hospital while the authorities figured out what to do with her. Somewhere in the region of about 163 samples of her bodily fluids and tissues were taken from her. But in 1910, she wanted to be freed, and it was granted to her on the condition that she signed an affidavit stating that she would stop working as a cook and to take proper hygienic measures to stop spreading the disease. Okay, now, although Mary agreed to these terms and she was allowed to return to the mainland, she worked briefly as a laundress before changing her name and resuming the better paying work as a cook, which not surprisingly led to more infections of typhoid fever wherever she went. The worst outbreak she was directly responsible for was at Sloan Hospital for Women in New York City, where she worked in 1915, and which resulted in 25 people coming down with the disease and 2 of them dying from it. Now, after this, the authorities arrested Mary and she was sent back to North Brother Island, where she would spend the next 2 decades languishing until her death at the age of 69, which occurred on November 11th, 1938. She died from pneumonia, and then ultimately, or unintentionally, she infected a total of 53 people with typhoid fever during her life. And the problem was this, that throughout the time, from the very beginning, that Typhoid Mary was being accused of and picked up as having spreading the disease, she didn't think it was true. She kept denying it. She still believed that she was responsible for spreading it and for the people that died, even from before. Even to the time of her death, she still believed that she was the one responsible for spreading the typhoid fever. Now, it was also around this time that New York is accepting huge numbers of immigrants that are coming from other countries, and the majority were forced into crowded and unsanitary living quarters. These diseases are spreading quickly, so the city had to do something, and Riverside was its answer. But the situation there wasn't much better. Out of sight, out of mind, conditions there were very bad, and the mortality rate among the patients was high, and the recovery rate slow. Which, of course, there was a cemetery there. There had to be a cemetery there. Now, the patients lived in tents, pavilions, cottages in and around the hospital. Like I said, those struggling with leprosy were confined to the wooden shacks in the perimeter. Now, when the weather was bad, the ferries that ran between North Brother Island and the Bronx were anchored and no food was delivered. According to those who survived and made it back to New York proper, life at Riverside was the black hole of Calcutta. Boy, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? Now, disease was not the only death associated with the island, as North Brother Island was the scene of what remains the worst maritime disaster ever recorded in New York history. On June 15, 1904, the passenger steamship General Slocum was carrying a large number of German immigrants from St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church on their way to a church picnic when the ship somehow caught fire. The burning, flaming ship eventually sank, and when the smoke cleared, about 1,021 of the 1,342 people on board had died, either from the fire or from drowning. The survivors of the wreck were taken to North Brother Island to receive medical care. Now, the wreck remained ensconced within its watery grave until it was salvaged to be converted into a barge, which was named the Maryland, which, strangely enough, would also sink into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean in 1911 while on a voyage to deliver a load of coal. Talk about a hunted ship. That was no coincidence. Now, by the 1940s, the grounds of Riverside Hospital had become a convalescence home for wounded World War II soldiers. And North Brother Island was transformed into a housing center meant for veterans and their families, but the need to take a ferry in order to get anywhere meant that many chose to relocate as soon as they could. The island gave one last dying gasp in the form of a drug rehab center for heroin addicts in the 1950s, but this too was to be short-lived, and the island fell silent in 1963, when all human activity there was ceased and the buildings decommissioned and abandoned to be left behind to the ages. The crumbling remains of North Brother Island and its abandoned quarantine hospital are now heavily overgrown, eerie ruins that lurk amid the unchecked foliage of the tiny forgotten island. The location is now strictly off-limits to the public. More chilling still is the fact that the forgotten, unwanted nature of the derelict building mirrors the tragic fate of many who pass through North Brother Island, especially those who never left the confines of Riverside Hospital alive. The crumbling ruins are the memorial, and those who look closely will find traces of those quarantine patients even today. Discarded toys, discarded keys are also heaped in piles. Phone books from the 1950s lie open to the last pages. Developed x-rays can still be read. Graffiti scrawled by patients long gone still cover the walls. In one building, the forlorn door of a nurse's station is pockmarked by bullet holes. It is perhaps no surprise at all that North Brother Island, with its history of death and who knows how many unmarked graves hiding within the underbrush is said to be lousy with ghosts. Visitors have reported various strange phenomena here, which have perhaps made them reconsider their journey to these desolate shores. Eerie sounds, phantom voices, unseen hands, touching, pulling, or shoving, malfunctioning electrical equipment, and EVP phenomena. This place covers a whole spectrum of ghostly phenomena. There have even been some cases of urban explorers fleeing the island in sheer terror, vowing never to return. This is a place not only spooky in appearance, but also apparently permeated by the despair and ghosts of its history. It makes one wonder if the sheer weight of pain and hardship can congeal and imprint itself into a place just as surely as an image onto film. Perhaps these are events and emotions that etched upon the fabric of reality itself. It is a creepy thought, to be sure. There are mysterious places all around us, some of them hiding in plain sight, whether it is because they are burdened with a tragic, dark history, tormented by the memories of the long dead who suffered there, or literally haunted by the spirits of the past. These are eerie locations not necessarily confined to the isolated corners of the world. Sometimes these locales can be found right amongst us, living parallel to our thrumming cities, as if on another plane of existence, forgotten echoes of a bygone time, reverberating through reality. There, amidst the streaks of our city lights and the tireless activity of humankind, these places squat, stuck between the dreamland of dead history and the bright beacons of our burgeoning development. Lost, rugged, mysterious lands in a sea of concrete.